We'll go forward with the speech. We're very happy to have Ajit Hutheesing tell us today some very interesting facts about the wonderful country of India, which I've had the pleasure of visiting on 3 separate trips, and I'm looking forward to it very much. So, Ajit, welcome.
Thank you. Is this on?
No, I'll put it. Let's see how we do this. So on.
That's it.
Now, yes, it's on.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. We've chosen a topic, India, its past, present, and future. And it's a small topic, but it has a broad sweep. And the reason I've chosen it is because I think knowing about India's past is absolutely essential in understanding its present, and its future. Now, the way I've divided up my talk, past, present, and future, is approximately 2,000 years of the past. So you can see it's going to be a very broad sweep of history. As far as the present is concerned, it's going to be from the 1930s to today. And as far as the future is concerned, I don't have to tell you where that's going, starting tomorrow. So let me quickly dwell with the major issues that I want to bring to your attention. Firstly, as far as the past is concerned, I'm trying to lay the foundations in your minds about what really persists in India, whether it's the past, present, or the future. And what are the persistent 3 major sort of foundation issues in India? The first of which that I want to very quickly deal with is the fact that India was, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, one of the more industrialized countries in the world. And you will recognize this to be true when you see, well, it was supposed to be one of the 5 greatest, but they didn't keep statistics the way they do now. So it's up to anyone to guess. But India was an attractive place for foreigners to come and trade. And it all started with the Islamic invasions of India. Before that also other ones, but I'm dealing with the main sweep of history. And it started with the Mughal empires being established in India, but they came in as traders. There was the Silk Route, which is very famous, which brought the Chinese and the Middle Easterners and the Eastern Europeans into India, and much later it was the British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, to mention just a few. Now, these people came to India because there was a lot to buy and a lot to sell. And obviously, India became a very welcoming place for them to come. There was very little warfare of any significance going on. And why were they so welcome to come to India and establish themselves while there were quite a lot of very difficult wars going on in Europe and other places? The reason is, and this is the next foundation point of what I want to talk about, is religions. India is the birthplace of 2 major philosophies. I call them philosophies, and you'll see why. The first is the Hindu philosophy, and out of the Hindu philosophy was born the Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism eventually escaped India through the Silk Route up to the north in China and to Japan going east. But Hinduism and Buddhism are in many respects very similar. And it was a philosophy and not a religion, in the sense that it was a debating platform. Hinduism was all about teachers talking to students, gurus talking to disciples. It was an exchange, a platform for the exchange of views all across the country. And the exchange of views meant there were many views that were disagreeable, or there was a lot of disagreement, but that's the essence of philosophic growth, disagreement. So when the gradual invasion of business started in India, everybody was very welcome because they brought new ideas and new goods and services, but it was also a very clever way that the Dutch East India Company and later on the British East India Company established themselves as major multinational corporations in India, so to speak, and they used this as a platform to infiltrate, if you will, the political areas of India, which meant the Maharajas, because the Maharajas controlled the various states in India. So I'm going to focus on the British right now because the others eventually faded away. And the British were extremely clever in the way they did things around the British Empire. They befriended the seats of power, and the seats of power were the Maharajas and the business community. So it became in everybody's commercial interest to befriend the British and to allow them to gradually take over India in a very silent and I would say by and large non-violent way. So this is the beginning of the third part of my looking at the past, and that's colonization. So the British effectively, and I'm not going to talk about the others as I said, colonized India very quietly, very successfully, and brought the Maharajas who controlled the powers in India into the British court, and they all were welcomed in the court of Queen Victoria and even before that. So the British, before I move into the present, I should say that one of the important things I missed on the religious end was that society divided itself into what you all know as the caste system. And the caste system started converting what was a philosophy into what I now call religions, and I distinguish them in that religion brought a lot of dogma, a lot of doctrine. You should do this, you shouldn't do that. You can only believe in this and you can only believe in that, or else you're destined to a very nasty future. But in India, the future mattered very little because the philosophy offered you the relief of reincarnation. So if things aren't so good in this life, perhaps they'll be better in the next. And this made for a very passive society, which was in turn very welcoming of progressive metastasizing of the cancer of colonialism. Now, one of the things that happened with colonialism is that the industrial India gradually became a colonial economy. A colonial economy is one which provides raw materials to service the mother country, in this case Britain, and then the manufactured goods are made in Britain and then they're sold back to the colonies. So it was a very good way of converting the Indian economy from an industrial economy into an agricultural, if you will, or a raw materials economy. Let me just move to the present, which, as I said, started in the 1930s, and this was with the arrival of Gandhi from Africa to India, a return of Gandhi to India, and he was warmly welcomed on literally his first day of arrival by a then very prominent family called the Nehrus. And the Nehrus had already established themselves as a British-friendly family. But young Jawaharlal Nehru was very anxious to join with Gandhi and to create what is now known as the independence movement. So Gandhi and Jawaharlal formed a formidable team. Gandhi was by and large the spiritual leader, Nehru was by and large his political arm. And the two basically preached and practiced nonviolence, and as some of you might know, on a personal note, and I should get this as Americans say, full disclosure, the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty is mainly Nehru. The Gandhi part of the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty is not Mahatma Gandhi, as some people often think. It just happened that Indira Nehru married a Gandhi. And Gandhi is like Jones or Smith in India. So it's a very common name, but it's now been elevated to history. But on a personal basis, my family is the Nehru family. Jawaharlal Nehru, the founder of this dynasty, was my mother's brother, and Indira Gandhi, who was Jawaharlal's daughter, was my mother's niece and my cousin. And the next generation was Rajiv Gandhi, Indira's son, who was my nephew. So I bring this up because I had a very vested interest as a family member in what was going on when I was growing up, and I was not all that young. I am now, but I wasn't then. And it was a very hard childhood because my uncle, for one, was sentenced in the aggregate to 25 years in prison. My father was sentenced to 5, spent 3, and then went back to prison again. And it was considered very noble to go to prison. So every time you went to prison, you could notch another star on your lapel. My mother spent 18 months in prison, but it was decided that she was one member of the family who had to stay home to look after the children. Because there were several children whose parents were all going to prison. Anyway, it's a very interesting story, but that's for another talk. I just want to talk now about independence and the hopes and aspirations of the people of India about what was going to happen after independence, after the British yoke was removed. The wonderful thing about nonviolence was that India and Britain parted as friends and remain the best of friends today. The worst thing about the British colonialism was the partition of India into Pakistan and Bangladesh. It was Pakistan, but now it's Pakistan and Bangladesh. It couldn't have been more damaging to the future of all these countries. And they carved India up the way they carved the Middle East up, and unfortunately we're still paying the price for it. I don't know how many of you know that India is considered a large country, but physically India is 1/3 the size, today's India, the size of the United States. 1/3. And it has 4 times the population. If you don't know anything else, and if you can figure the economics that you learn and practiced, you will know what a big burden the population is when concentrated in a relatively small landmass. So I want to touch very briefly now on what happened to the economic dream that Nehru and the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty preached. Well, what happened was that they were all, including my father and Nehru, educated in British universities. And of course they all came back from Britain as Fabian socialists. And there was no worse system than Fabian socialism, which not only affected India's development, but affected Australia, affected Canada, wherever the Brits had their empire. So, but India, because of its large population, suffered a much bigger penalty from colonialism. So coming to the point of what happened with the socialist economic development plan, well, what happened was we had 2% growth for many, many years, and that 2%, as usual, was skewed towards the wealthier people, the business community, and a very slow growing middle class. Unfortunately, for the bulk of the population, very little growth. They remained as they had been for centuries. And that population of the lower classes, lower economic classes, and many times the lower caste classes, just sprouted because they had nothing else to do but to create babies. And so we had about 400 million poor people in India that had to be uplifted. And it was thought then, and I think there's some truth to it, that traditional capitalism, when you're so weighted down by 400, now 600 million, then 400, 600 million people today who are making less than $3 a day, and I would say a good 200 of them are making less than $1 a day. So it's hard to figure how you're going to lift these masses up with the capital structure of the country. Think of your balance sheets with maybe 1 million taxpayers in the country, up the upper echelon, and maybe now 300 million middle class. Now, But for all these years, that middle class was small, the upper class was very small, economically speaking, and very, very rich, very small. And today we now have, and I'm coming now to the future, today we have a challenge. How will we, with the new elections, which frankly and fortunately brought an end to my family's, the Nehru family's dynasty. No democracy is worthy of a dynasty. And one of the reasons I left India was precisely because of the socialist dynastic issues that were coming up when I was a student in college and in university abroad. I didn't feel this was an atmosphere in which I, as a young man, could thrive. And I saw there was a brain drain coming out of India, so I joined the group and left the country, first to go to Britain and then to come here. But part of the, forget about me, the point is this is a historical issue in India. And today we now look at the future and we see that the recent elections are going to give us a lot of hope. First, because of the end of the dynasty. Secondly, because we are going to have a much more of a market-related system. It's going to be a much more capitalist. But having said that, in my view, that capitalism is not by itself sufficient. And let me say something that I should have touched upon earlier. When socialism took root in India, so did two other things. Corruption was one of them. Regulation was the other. Well, regulation breeds corruption and corruption breeds regulation. So with the passage of time, India became a hugely corrupt country. And I'm talking about now. It's not, I can't go to India for 2 weeks without spending some money at the airport that I didn't intend to, and then spending money elsewhere that I didn't intend to. It's really bad, and it's really, I do blame the dynastic issues, and many would rightly say that perhaps members of my family pocketed some of the amounts of money that are sitting in Switzerland. Let me tell you a little anecdote, there's still a little time. I got a call about 2 years ago. I had written an article in the Financial Times, and I got a call back from Switzerland. Somebody had read the article, a very old friend of mine, a Swiss banker, and he had passed it around a board meeting. And he called me up from the board meeting, and he said, I'm not going to imitate his accent, it was very, very, very British. And he said, "Oh, Ajit, this is just an absolutely wonderful thing you've done. So what are you doing about the $1.7 trillion of Indian money sitting in Swiss banks?" So I said, "I'm letting you spend it." It is amazing. The Indian economy today is 1.4 trillion. And it is 1/12 the size of the US economy. It is 1/5 the size of the Chinese economy, whereas 20-30 years ago we had exactly the same per capita incomes. So you can see where India is and where the rest of the world has moved beyond. But the point of the story of the 1.7 trillion is that this is sitting in the hands of a few great business houses and a lot of very rich politicians. And some say that includes Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, and I wish they'd pass some of it on to me, but they haven't. I would return to India if they had. I would join the political situation if they had. But anyway, I think the major obstacle, looking forward, looking to the future, is we do need an open market system. We do need a much more capitalistic environment, but we must address the 600 million people who are weighing down. It's an anchor that just pulls the whole country down. And until you can do that, I'm really afraid that you may show 9 or 10% economic growth, but it's all going to be siphoned off at the top. And if it doesn't get down to the bottom, and it's not going to be filtering down, that system isn't going to work in India. It's going to have to be, in some ways, the government and the private sector and international investments in India, particularly as it relates to the infrastructure. Today, a big city like Bombay with 17 million people is crumbling. It's It's awful to go to Bombay and see driving from the airport is a nightmare, and living there must be even worse. So apart from a few rich enclaves, the city is crumbling, and that's happening all over India. There isn't enough money right now in the world to rebuild India, available money. But there is enough, I think, to start the process. And so I'm very hopeful, looking forward, that those investments will come to India. The new government will prove welcoming to foreign investments and to business, and will concentrate on education at the lower end of the spectrum of population. I should also add that the technology revolution has taken place in India. Fortunately, United States and Silicon Valley has played a very important role in bringing Indians into prominence in Silicon Valley, and in turn those Indians creating, through the brain drain going backwards, back into India, creating a vibrant technological base in India. And you all know that's one of our most successful parts of our economy, Bangalore, Hyderabad, to mention two. So I'm hopeful that the technology revolution will bring, well, it already has, brought cell phones to 200 million, 300 million people. Now, cell phones are the first way where people can find out what's going on in the rest of the world. They can access the internet if it's available, and it's not generally available. So I'm very hopeful that technology will revolutionize the growth of India, and that if we do get 7, 8, 9% growth, it will be more balanced. And that if it's not, we have a social dynamite waiting to explode, especially with the education of the masses. They're not going to sit back as they have for the past 2,000 years. And this is why I mentioned the passivity of Indian societies that allowed them to emperors and empires and businesses to come to India. That's not going to be the case in the future. There's going to be a social unrest. It's already started, and it'll be widespread. So I'm hoping that that doesn't happen, and I'm optimistic that it will not. But for those of you who want to rush out and get into the stock market and buy Indian ETFs on the New York Stock Exchange, I would say the honeymoon is somewhat over. The stock market has gone up in India by the factor of 30% in the last 6 months. One in anticipation of the election, and then after the results of the election. But this is not going to continue, and it's probably as high as it's going to be. Maybe it'll get a little higher. I would wait, and I would put a small percentage of my assets into India, maybe 6 or 8 months from now, when the dust has settled, the romance is over, and the policies emerge. So thank you very much. I'm open to your questions. Thank you.
So all the Gandhis that we all think are coming from Mahatma are...
No. Unfortunately, Mahatma Gandhi's sons have left a legacy of, with the exception of one grandson, has left a legacy of alcoholism and disrepair and dysfunction. No. It just happened to be Indira Gandhi's husband. Yeah.
This is a follow-up to your question on your comment about technology and the shift of talent back to it. When I was in graduate school at Columbia in 1958, a professor said that he was lamenting the poor spending of money on manpower development around the world. And he said, and he gave us a negative example. He said, India, it can only use 4% of its engineers, and it's putting vast amounts of money into the training of engineers, where they need teachers and doctors and things like that. The interesting thing is what a prescient idea that was, because well in advance of the technological revolution here, they were preparing for it. They built it as a substructure. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's not so much that they were consciously preparing for it. There was a tradition, particularly in South India, of education. We had the theory of numbers, at least one set of theory of numbers was developed in India. So science and technology was developing as a matter of learning, as a matter of philosophical development in India. So there's a very interesting subject called the history of philosophy, although philosophy of science, both. Philosophy of science is the one I wanted to refer to. So India was a hotbed of learning. Big frustration in India was that people got educated as you're highly educated, and they couldn't get jobs. And people would come to our offices in India saying, I've got a master's degree in accounting or this or that. Can you give me a job? And we would say, we don't have a job. He said, can I be a messenger? Can I be a peon, as the British called them? In the lowest possible job. And then many of them would go and commit suicide because they couldn't support their families. So that was a very, but today there's in fact a shortage of engineers. And if we go into infrastructure building, which is clearly the most important thing we can do, I think our engineers and so on will be absorbed very rapidly. Yeah, Chuck.
You mentioned that corruption is a systemic problem. Is that recognized in India, and what can be done about it?
Put the guys in jail is what I say.
How big are the jails?
We send them to the United States. They can go to Cuba. No, it's a serious question. How do you deal with it? And I really think it's a very difficult problem, because all the vested interests are corrupt. And I have a separate talk of what I call the 6 bubbles in India and what could blow the Indian economy into pieces. But that's another subject. But corruption can only be dealt with by punishing those who are corrupt. That's one way of doing it. There is another way that I hope will prevail, and that is amnesty. And that is to give, everybody knows who's corrupt. It's not as though it's a secret. And many of them are taking openly. At least 40 members of parliament have criminal charges against them. I mean, they've been indicted. I mean, they're still in parliament. But as far as corruption is concerned, the people are building 25,000 square foot mansions on salaries of $5,000 a year. So something's happening which is visible. And so I think the way to address the problem is to give amnesty, let them bring them some large part of the money back, and then say the clock starts now. Anything that goes on from now on, there are going to be serious consequences. And the judicial system is clogged. I filed a lawsuit 25 years ago, hasn't come up for its first hearing. I've given up on it and said I'm never going to get it. It's not in my lifetime. So I don't know how well the lawsuits will survive, but maybe criminal proceedings with a special court would work. But that's the only way I can see of dealing with corruption. The other way will be the middle class is by and large not part of the system. It is at the upper end, but not at the middle and the lower end. So as the middle class gets bigger, and as the voters get more educated, you'll begin to see movements against the corrupt officials. And there'll be a slow cleansing period, but it's going to slow down our economic growth. Go ahead.
You mentioned part of the biggest historical issue that they're still paying for is the split off of Pakistan and Bangladesh. Looking toward the future, do you see issues that will bring those two parties to an ultimate conflagration again? Or is that war over?
No. I think it's a very good question, and it's a very serious question, because Pakistan is probably the most explosive part of the world. We may be looking at Iran today, and Pakistan has nuclear weapons and the capacity to use them. So I think Pakistan represents a danger for the entire world. And I don't think there's any circumstance under which India would want to unite with Pakistan again in terms of its borders. But I think business between India and Pakistan, there's some overtures by both prime ministers after the recent election. So there may be some hope, but I think it's as I was saying, one of my other talks about the 6 bullets. One of those bullets is that India is surrounded by neighbors. Pakistan, China, Burma, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Well, at one time, 5 out of 5 of them were in major turmoil. China is already pressing at India's borders. They've got territorial ambitions. They've already taken over some 15,000 square miles of India in the Himalayan region, and that argument is still persisting. They're doing that in the South China Seas. Pakistan is exploding in our midst. Burma, not exploding anymore, but it was a troubled society. Sri Lanka has already exploded and settled down. So we've got this neighboring climate on top of all the other problems of population and religion and caste, and we've got this very, very difficult neighborhood that we live in. And I don't have great hopes for Pakistan. I think this is, if India's prosperity is probably the best thing for Pakistan, if they can develop a federal trading bloc between the countries. But you're right, Robert, this is a very serious issue, and it could make everything else disappear. Yeah, go ahead. He's a professor of Indian politics.
No. You spoke very much about, as a well-founded optimism about economic policies. There's a lot of concern about cultural politics. You know, he has a very bad reputation concerning Muslims in the country.
Right.
And just this morning, in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw the article, in which he's made a variety of rules concerning the non-use of English in the central government, and the emphasis of Hindi as being the truly only national language. Could you comment on the cultural aspects and the consequences that might have for the economic?
Well, it's also a very good question. I mean, India today has multicultures, but let's say the two big ones are Hinduism and Islam. India is the second largest Islamic country in the world after Indonesia. So division of India into India and Pakistan didn't solve that problem, thanks to the British. Good friends of mine, as they say. But yes, cultural divisiveness is really broken down into the caste system. It's really, and education is a major factor to lift people out of it. So, and intermarriage is a big factor. So I think it is happening, but the cultural issues are huge in India. And they talk about every single burden that you can identify. That's one of the big ones. And how to deal with it? You can't deal with it the way you just said, the New York Times. I didn't read the article today, but we have 26 accepted languages in India. Those are accepted. Before the 26 languages were accepted by Parliament, there were 200 languages in India. We just have to say no more this, no more that, no more this. And there are basically two major languages, English and Hindi, which all the schools have to teach everybody. So there's a slow Englishization, Hindiization of India, but it's very slow because education is very slow. But I do think this kind of policy, that only this language would be spoken, only that, we don't need to waste our time and efforts fracturing the community this way. It doesn't work. So I'm disappointed to hear that, but I'll go and read the article. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, in terms of the passivity that you mentioned, and it is a factor with respect to the religion. You better behave in this life.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're going to have a terrible second life.
Yeah.
If you come back as a turtle.
Yes.
Right. So that system has held for so many years. But you've got 600 million people who are behaving. And you really wonder how long further can that hold. That's a real danger that you mentioned about the exploding. You could really have a terrible explosion.
Absolutely. And I mean, that was part of the theme of my talk about the future. I think that the cultural issues, the social pressures, the bubble, that's one of my 6 bubbles, keeps growing every year. But if you don't address it, one day it's going to pop. And so I think that's The answer is that there is no immediate answer. In a way, the reincarnation issue was a good one. I mean, if people say, look, if I behave myself, I'll have a better life. So the path to the better future was not economic growth, or it was behavior. So, yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Ajit, I have two questions, both related to population. The first is the Indian government doing anything, or should they do anything about it? And the second question is, you mentioned China surpassing India. Is that partly due to the fact that China has done a better job in controlling their population?
It's amazing. The population control is a double-edged sword. For China, they don't have enough young people. India has the youngest population probably in the world. Our average age is 27, and it represents the greatest potential future market for goods and services of any country, any population in the world. So yes, it's a problem, population. It's becoming an opportunity now. Question is, can we rise to that opportunity, and can foreign investment help us rise to that opportunity? We can't do it ourselves. There isn't enough capital in India. There aren't enough raw materials and resources in India. So this has got to be a global partnership between India and others, or it's not going to happen. Yeah.
What's the status of, let's say, the armaments of people over there? We know in the Middle East, everybody has a Kalashnikov rifle or a gun, but is there any laws that suppress ownership of guns so the weapons aren't there for local fighting?
Well, yes. The answer is there's very little weaponry around outside the government, outside the army. Very little militias. There are some very, very well-armed militias who are creating explosions all over India, and disrupted ones. And again, they are a relatively small band, but very, very damaging, like some of the Boko Haram that you hear about in Nigeria or other places. They create a lot of turmoil, but it's a serious problem, Mark. I don't want to diminish it, but it's not because arms are widespread. They're not.
Take one more question.
Yeah.
What is India's current relationship to Bangladesh in terms of economics or economic dependency?
Well, the relationship is somewhat abrasive because a lot of Bangladeshi refugees have come into West Bengal, which is India, East Bengal, which is Pakistan, which is Bangladesh. And the refugee problem, it's a bit like Syria. It's huge. There are about 2 million refugees from Bangladesh pouring in every day. So how to handle that is creating a friction between Bangladesh. But otherwise, Bangladesh and India, Bangladesh has its own internal political eruptions, but it has little to do with India. India is at peace with Bangladesh. It's probably a good partner, trading partner in the future. I'm much more optimistic about that.
Ajit, thank you. That's a wonderful.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful presentation on a fascinating subject, and we're very, very appreciative of you taking the time to do that.
Thank you.